why don't we start with the take that has launched a thousand takes, and that is your take on pornography. So over the past few weeks, there's been this widespread debate that was launched because you talked about the outlawing of pornography at the federal level. First of all, why don't you lay out your position on what exactly federal law should be with regard to pornography?
Yeah, I think, well, there's two things here. There's what we could practically actually do, and there's ideally what should be done, and I recognize that those two things are separate here, because I don't think there could be a federal law just banning all pornography right now, especially with the way the Supreme Court has decided on this. I think that there should be. I'd like it if there were, just like with abortion. I'd like that as well, but there can't be because of the Supreme Court. I think what practically could be done are enforcing, just like those, what really started this was the letter from the few Republicans urging the Department of Justice to just enforce obscenity laws that are on the books. I think that could be a good step. And then even further, things like, an opt-in option like some countries have, where you have to call your service provider, opt in if you want pornographic content, segregate the content to a separate part, .xx domain, things like that, and things, requiring, maybe you have to present ID or some sort of identification information if you want to access this material. These, I think, are basic steps that would, at a minimum, protect children, because that's been my focus with this, is that children are exposed to this so much, and the effect that has on them psychologically and emotionally, and in so many other ways. And
yeah, Matt,
I think that
I totally agree with this, actually. I mean, I wrote an entire book back in 2005 that went largely ignored called Porn Generation, about the impact that pornography was having on young men, in particularly the desensitization of men to how women ought to be treated, turning them into basically a series of body parts as opposed to treating them as holistic human beings, how this is part of the generalized sexual revolution. So one of the things that has been puzzling, Matt, has been sort of the breakdown to me between conservatives and libertarians over this issue. I consider myself more libertarian on governmental issues, but I don't think that the government has no role to play in protecting children from pornography. And in fact, I don't even think you need to make an anti-libertarian case in order to argue that pornography has significant externalities, particularly with regard to children. I'm sort of puzzled why so many libertarians are anti-cracking down on hardcore pornography's distribution to kids under 18, for example.
Yeah, and especially those who would still identify in some way as conservative, because the thing is, obviously, if this case was being made 30 years ago, if anything like internet porn existed 30 years ago, like it does today, and there were conservatives saying, hey, we need to crack down on this, and pretty much everyone who called themselves a conservative 30 years ago would have at least taken that argument seriously. Maybe not all have all agreed, but these days now you have conservatives just recoiling in horror at the very notion that the government would do anything about it. And that I find absurd, and I agree with you. There's been this interesting discussion about is the government to protect the common good, or is it about preserving liberties? And I think that's an interesting discussion and fascinating, and we could have that debate. But I think that we don't even need really to get into that, because if you focus it on the fact that children are exposed to it, and because people like to say, well, people consent, if people choose to pursue this content, they consent to seeing it, so there's no role for the government. Well, I would say that children cannot consent. That's why we say that if an adult has sex with a child, it's rape automatically, no matter what the child said, because the child does not have the emotional and psychological capacity to consent. And if the child can't consent to be a second-party participant in a sexual act, I would say they can't consent to be a third-party participant as a witness. So every time a child is exposed to pornography, I would say they're being essentially abused by the person who put it on the internet, knowing that a child could access it.
Now, this did lead to a broader debate, and this one I think is actually pretty important inside the conservative movement right now, between conservatives and libertarians over the role of government, not, again, because of the views on pornography. You and I agree on the evils of pornography, but with regard to the role of government generally. So I've contrasted in the past what I've called common good conservatism with rights-based conservatism. There are a lot of folks on the right these days who are talking about quote-unquote common good conservatism, basically the idea that the government exists to promote the common good, to act as a teacher, to act as a moral arbiter. I've been very wary of that simply because I believe that the best role for government is to stay pretty much out of everybody's life so far as you're not invading anybody else's rights, and that the role of social institutions like churches is to fill that gap, and that we ought to be strengthening those social institutions. We ought to pour our hearts and souls into doing that. But the moment you grant government extra power to, quote unquote, do what you want, then you are also granting the bad guys on the other side the power to use that power against you. And I'm much more fearful the left is going to use government power to invade the rights of religious people than to defend the rights of religious people.
Yeah, well, I think the way that I would try to split the baby there is I would agree with you that saying the government's primary role or one of its primary roles is to be a moral teacher. That is a little troubling for, I think, obvious reasons. And so I understand that argument. But at the same time, I do think that the fundamental reason why the government exists, the reason why governments are instituted in the first place, is to facilitate and preserve the common good. And if we say, well, no, it's about preserving rights, well, but why does it matter? Why should the government preserve rights? Why do rights matter? Well, the only reason it matters is because it's good. It's right. That's so I would say that's part of the common good. I guess my point is I don't see how we separate rights from the common good. I think they're a package deal, and the good is even more fundamental. It lies beneath as a foundation for human rights. So that's.
I agree with you that rights, that individual rights, are part of the common good. The problem is that when the government is in charge of both the common good and protecting individual rights, the government is in conflict with itself all the time. And so the way that the founders, I believe, drew this out was that the government was there to protect individual rights and social institutions were there to protect the common good. I'm also very, very doubtful that the government has the capacity to act in the interests of preserving, for example, religious values or even conservative social mores. The government has actually done a horrible job of doing that, and in fact has invaded those social mores. The more government you grant to more power you grant to a government to do that, the harder that's going to become, particularly on the federal level. When you get to the local level, I have some more crossover and agreement with you. I think that if a local government wants to go further than the national government does, that makes some sense, given the fact that it's a more homogenous community. It's actually, you can trust the government more at that level than you can when you're talking about a broad federal government. But when you grant the broad federal government a bigger government gun to go after stuff that is in the quote-unquote common interest, more likely than that is going to be turned against the very people who require the protection, namely religious communities.
Yeah, I can see that argument. I don't really disagree with anything you're saying. I guess what I would kind of agree with what most libertarians say, which is the government has a role only when other people are being harmed. So if you're doing something in your own home and it's between consensual adults, there's nobody else around, no one else is being harmed by it, then the government really has no role. And that's why I don't think the government acts like a church or like an institution like that, where the church does have something to say about the things you do, even in your home when no one else is. The church has something to say about the things you think in your head. Obviously, we don't want the government saying anything about that. So, yeah, when I think the government should step in potentially when other people are being harmed by a particular act. My difference, though, with a lot of libertarians is that they seem to have a very limited view sometimes of what sorts of things harm other people. And I would argue that pornography, because of children, and not just because of that, but for other reasons as well, is harmful, is actually actively, directly harmful to other people. And that's why the government should step in.
I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.